Hello, my name is Soraya Mia and you're watching It's About Youth. Now, on the 13th of December, the first EU-ASEAN Summit and the EU-ASEAN Youth Summit took place in Brussels, where young leaders actually shared their different perspectives of the EU-ASEAN relationship. So, before we start the conversation, let me just introduce our guests for the day. We have Qyira Yusri, who is the co-founder of UNDI 18, as well as the special advisor to the EU Commissioner, one of the EU commissioners. I'll actually have you explain that later. And we also have Carmen, who is the head of the Malaysian Youth Association for Diplomacy and Policy, or MyADP. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining me on the show tonight. Qyira, let's begin. So you just got back from Brussels.
I have, yeah.
Tell us, what was your experience there, and what do you think was the most interesting part of the summit?
I think maybe just a brief introduction to my role in the context of the EU-ASEAN Summit. So besides running UNDI 18, this year I've also had the privilege of being the EU Special Advisor on Youth to EU Commissioner Yrta Urpilainen of International Partnerships. What that means is that I advise the Commissioner on youth-related policies, on what kind of support the EU should provide to non-EU countries, and specifically focusing on youth, peace and security, which is largely my work here in Malaysia. So this EU-ASEAN Summit in particular is very, very important and very unique, because one of the side events that I personally find super cool is the youth event itself. So this time around, we actually have participants from across EU and ASEAN, meaning we had young people from Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, all coming in talking about the important partnership that we can form. And one of the interesting things when I was attending the summit itself was that, number one, the location itself was in the Residence Palace, right next to the actual meeting place of the EU-ASEAN leaders. So you can really feel the importance of just being in that proximity and talking about important issues. And secondly is that the interventions and recommendations that the EU-ASEAN delegates worked on were able to be presented directly to the EU Commissioner, to myself, to the Dutch Ambassador for Youth, to the Deputy Director General of International Partnerships, and so much more important stakeholders. And one thing that I think that's really make a difference this time around is that for months, as youth delegates, we tried to lobby to be present during the EU-ASEAN meeting to talk about our interventions. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but we settled on the next best thing, which was that the youth delegates recorded a video highlighting the importance of the EU-ASEAN partnerships, highlighting the interventions, the recommendations, and it was played during the EU-ASEAN meeting. So we know for sure that the EU-ASEAN leaders, the Prime Ministers, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, all the EU, even the EU Presidents, Prime Ministers, were able to hear from EU-ASEAN youth.
Wow, that's really interesting. And it also pretty much relates with the EU-ASEAN theme of this year, which is the Year of the Youth. Yes. Now, Carmen, you work a lot with youths and young people, advocating policy literacy and whatnot. With what Qyira just shared, why do you think it's really important for Malaysian youths to actually care about EU-ASEAN relations?
Well, I mean, as what Qyira said, it's incredibly important because, all that funding, all those access to people in power, where does that play a role in Malaysia, and how can youth access that? Obviously young people, and I think the Malaysian public in general want to know where this funding is going to, what projects it's going to, and how it can benefit young people. An example of something that's incredibly relevant to youth today is things that the European Union are funding, like the Erasmus schemes, going abroad to study, gaining more opportunity, cross-cultural learning. It's incredibly important that this happens. Yeah.
This summit, what do you think it benefits the youth of Malaysia, Qyira?
I think, so I was very pleasantly surprised to see there were Malaysian youth delegates attending, even from university students as well. I met a few of them. I think what's important is that when we attend these sort of programs is the network and connection that we build there. Like Carmen mentioned earlier, right, the EU during these events also promoted and highlighted the impact of their programs, like the SHARE program, the Erasmus Plus programs, the multiple exchange programs that you have. And these kind of programs are really important for youth development and youth growth, because you are able to go on these opportunities to experience the world, to learn from our counterparts and to learn on issues, not just it's not just traveling to Europe, right? It's also learning about issues of security, issues of climate change, issues of youth democracy, governance. So when I was there, we talked a lot about freedom of speech, especially in the context of many ASEAN countries. It can be very sensitive. It can also be very interesting discussions and to have. We tackled the issues of hybrid threats, tackled issues of misinformation, climate change, climate finance. We talked about COP. These are all conversations that, when you allow young people to take up space organically, these discussions will end up having very productive outcomes. And what's most important that when we come back to our own countries, our own communities, is that we apply our learnings as well. So for me personally, I think looking into, it's very timely, because looking into what should Undi 18 focus on next year, what should be, and then now we have new Minister and Deputy Ministers for Youth and Sports as well. What can we support them in? What can we push Malaysia's youth policies angles towards? I think that's really, really important. And I think most interesting is that how does it play into our foreign policy? What is Malaysia's foreign policy? What is our Malaysia's foreign stances? And how does it benefit Malaysian youth? Because it's not just about, treaties or trade and things like that, but youth development need to play an important aspect when we talk about foreign policy as well. So I think these opportunities is very important for Malaysian youth to get exposure in, because if we want to remain competitive as Malaysians.
Right. When we talk about foreign policy and diplomacy and whatnot, we cannot we can't just ignore what is happening, with the Ukraine and the Russia war right now. But I'm not to go into the details of that, but we know that Malaysia always remains neutral. So how do you think that we can perhaps shape the future generations to get a non-biased view of the issue, and how do we understand a bigger picture? How do we shape the future generations?
Very interesting that you mentioned the word bias, and I think the word, everyone has an innate bias, otherwise you practically not be a human being. But it's really important that we look at the matter from all sorts of perspectives, and that's something that MYADP, we support young people in doing Model United Nations, which is a role-playing activity where young people get to play diplomats, from different countries, leaders of Malaysia, regional leaders like Qyira was talking about, and they come together and they discuss about these, incredibly devastating issues at hand. And it's important that young people have access to things like this, because we understand that war is a product of diplomacy failing. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we have young people understand and role-play different ministers, role-play different foreign diplomats, and understand where each side is coming from, where each country's priorities come when perhaps considering entering into conflict. It puts such an important emphasis on why young people should really look into things like foreign relations, even if you want to just know about general knowledge about what's happening in the world. Why, we have inflation in Malaysia, why, your extra egg on your fried rice is costing a bit more. It's incredibly important that young people have these accesses so that they'll be able to understand why the tiny little things in their life that they think are untouchable by these events are actually occurring.
How can we improve the young Malaysian leaders in terms of diplomacy and policy making, Qyira?
I think number one is that having the initiative to look out for opportunities for self-development and self-growth. I think MyADP is a really cool program, which I'll let Carmen talk about. But the idea is that even for myself, I was just reflecting on my journey as a youth advocate since I graduated and all that. A lot of times, the opportunities that I come across come from my personal curiosity to look for these opportunities. So for young people, if we are interested in nation building, interested in foreign policy, interested even on specific thematic issues like climate change, human rights, it's important to look out for this opportunity, look out for these spaces, and actively participate in it. So the thing is that now, for a lot of us, we're consuming media like every day, all the time, right? But how many of us actively participate in creating or countering or reacting? And I think in the age of where information comes like lightning to so many of us, as young people, we have a big role to play to counter these misinformation, disinformation, and keeping ourselves educated and up to date with correct information is the first step towards moving towards a society where we're able to critically analyze information. So I think in this context, to be a globally engaged citizen, for young Malaysians, I recommend checking out the EU Commission's latest document, the Youth Action Plan that we just finalized and submitted and approved by the European Council. The Youth Action Plan details specific interventions, even step by step, what institutions should do to meaningfully engage young people. You know, it is applicable to universities, to governments, to the EU delegations, even to youth organizations. How do we meaningfully engage young people and not just see them as a token or see them as a place to, okay, we have a round table, let's have one youth delegate here. You know, I mean, we need to start from we need to start from somewhere, of course, you know, and I think one ideal situation is that when we go to these, you know, important meetings, that maybe our Ministry of Foreign Affairs would consider bringing youth delegates along. I know they sent a youth delegate to the UNGA this year. I think Elisa was one of the youth sent there. But most importantly is that, you know, what are you doing in these spaces, you know? So when we attend these conferences, these events, it's important that we take up space and we talk about the experiences and submit concrete interventions. So we have to start somewhere, start from attending forums, start from joining programs, applying to scholarships, and most importantly, take up space when we do attend these programs.
Yeah, but Qyira, you know, when you mentioned attending these special meetings and whatnot, and we have to bring back, you know, localized issues, global issues back to Malaysia. And we understand as well that a lot of Malaysians, we have this, you know, language barrier thing. So how can we actually give more opportunity to, you know, perhaps people in the more rural areas to be more involved in sort of bilateral relations, international relations, or maybe even, you know, young leaders that are good in the future? What do you think of this?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting point, you know, because when you attend a lot of international meetings, right, a lot of the government delegates, I mean, when they send delegates in and they know that maybe the delegates can't speak English, there's actually translators provided, especially at important meetings, because, you know, when we have important spaces like this, it's key that no one feels left out. So, you know, if we're sincere and genuine about including people from different backgrounds, different demographics, we also have to put in resources for that, you know, and it's not just about language translators, it's about sign language translation, it's about, you know, captioning, subtitles in any of our digital content. I was very proud to see, you know, whenever larger institutions like UNICEF, EU, they do programs, they do have translators available. I've done programs supported by UNICEF where part of their requirements is providing live language translations, providing a sign language interpreter as well at programs. So these are not barriers, actually. You know, if we are genuine in engaging everyone from all backgrounds, as organizers, we don't see it as an extra burden, but we see it as part and parcel of organizing. And I think it's also timely for us as attendees to also pressure organizers to be inclusive. Because, you know, one thing that, you know, I've always believed is that, you know, we can't have representation if we are not including everyone in. So there's no point talking about, you know, we represent all youth or we represent all this if you don't actually have representation from different sectors of community. Just a quick one, right? So for example, under the international partnerships, there is a global youth sounding board under the European Commission that I've had the privilege to work with. So they made out 25 youth all over the world, specifically in non-EU countries that also consults with us on the youth action plan, on any policy suggestions, policy direction for the EU Commission. So the group is made up of, it's the most diverse group I've ever seen. You know, you have representation from all sectors, from governments, from activists, human rights, climate, disability activists. You know, you have youth from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean. You know, I've met so many different people through this youth sounding board. And I think Malaysia can emulate that. I'm really hoping that, you know, our governments, our institutions prioritize this sort of like consultative group in their process. Yeah, because then you can really say that you're able to form policies or directions or even ideas that are truly acceptable to, you know, most of society.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of this? Perhaps how could you learn, you know, in my ADP on what Qyira just said? Like, how does the diversity process work?
I think when it comes to the question of diversity, in my experience in working in my ADP, we realized that sometimes the activity which we promote, Model UN, can be quite limited to valleys such as the Klang Valley area, because that's where a lot of international schools are. I think the exposure of such an educational activity to more rural areas is something that some governmental agencies can definitely support. I think for MYADP, this is one of the key reasons as to why our organization exists in the first place, because we believe that it is imperative to understand everything, Qyira just mentioned, but also it's incredibly important for young children to be able to understand, not to just make noise, but to also, when you're from such a disadvantaged community like that, come up and say, look, I've written you a solution. I've made you a solution. How do you get those skills from making the solutions? You come together, you compromise, you negotiate, you write it down. And that is exactly what Model UN is, because you're simulating a diplomat at the United Nations doing all these things. And it's incredibly, strong skill that young people must have today, because, and I'm sure Qyira has seen in her advocacy work, you have many people making noise, taking up space, but sometimes it's very, I feel like young people I've spoken to get quite apathetic because they don't know what solutions to take. They know and they recognize a problem, especially when they come from a marginalized or underprivileged communities like you've mentioned, but they don't know how to take up solutions or how to make them. And by introducing them, and I one day hope that our education system can support a program like Model UN or EAYDP to empower young people to start not only making noise, but to also come up with solutions from the ground.
Talking about, education system, what do you think this new administration can sort of do to empower more of this, advocacy, education, especially with the young Malaysians?
That's a very loaded question.
Let's get apolitical in it.
Yeah. No, I mean, of course, I have a long wish list of what our education could look like. Who doesn't, right? We all care about education. We've, a large majority of us have been through the public education system and we care about it. So, personally, for me, I think I would love if we could start at looking at teachers' autonomy. I've worked a little bit in education before. I come from a family, generations of teachers, so, very strict at home. But I think teachers are really undervalued in our society. We rely on teachers to take care of our children for hours on a day, like unpaid babysitters, but we don't give them the freedom and autonomy to be creative in how they teach students. So, I think the culture of debate, culture of critical thinking, culture of questioning could be cultivated much better if teachers were given flexibility in conducting their lessons and their classes, and also, reducing the burden of administrative work. I think teachers need more support to do all that. They can't be seen as, a clerk, admin, babysitter, caretaker, and educator at the same time. It's impossible for one human being to do all that. So I really hope that we look into teacher reform and, talking about how do we actually empower local leaders, and I'm talking about principals, teachers, penolong kanans, these individuals to be able to help the community in the best way they know how, because they are working in that community, and not just having governments or ministries providing one-size-fit-all solutions and hoping for the best.
Yes. All right, now back to the whole EU-ASEAN summit. Where do you think Malaysia actually stands, in terms of within the ASEAN nations, with the people that you see? You said that you met a lot of the youth delegates from all over the world. So where do you think Malaysia stands, and how do you think we can actually improve and perhaps become leaders, to lead on the global scale? Anyone? You want to start first?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was no one from the Malaysian government that was attending the EU-ASEAN Youth Summit, which I felt quite ashamed, because there were so many amazing recommendations coming from it. But I think moving forward, I hope that the government would look into not just attending the formal meetings of EU-ASEAN Summit, the Business Summit, but looking at the higher education, education, youth. These are all side events that also provide a lot of value and impact to our policy making process here in Malaysia. So, and I think for Malaysian leaders, it's important to see these platforms as not just a way to talk about Malaysia, but to also learn from other countries as well, especially, and not just from EU countries, but also non-EU countries, because these events are attended by non-EU partners as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there in terms of knowledge exchange, learning, and most importantly, for me as an activist, is solidarity. You know, I meet young youth activists from different countries, you know, understanding the context and what they've learned and how they advocate with their governments is also a really eye-opening experiences, and it's just so much to learn from. And, you know, putting aside partisan politics within our Malaysian context, I think, you know, young people should learn and should be given these opportunities equally, and these opportunities should not be gatekept by anyone.
Sorry, Carmen, so this also reminds me to the next question. The first EU-ASEAN Youth Diplomats Program is actually going to happen next year, perhaps in February or March, early next year. Why is this actually relevant, and how does it work, and why do you think this is important to Malaysian youth?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, why it's relevant, well, as Qyira has been to the actual EU-ASEAN Youth Summit, well, this is a diplomacy exercise fully funded by the European Union, so anyone can apply as long as you're 18 to 25.
Anyone?
Anyone. So as long as you're 18 to 25, you're a Malaysian or someone studying in a Malaysian institution, and you will be in Malaysia from the 17th to 19th of February. Applications, by the way, close on the 8th of January. It's important for these forums to happen because you know, much of the really amazing things that Qyira has mentioned obviously comes from, you know, a long while of learning how to negotiate and learning how to pitch things, you know, which is why you have these youth forums. But you don't exactly have a lot of spaces in which young people can do that. A lot of the co-curriculars we have in Malaysia, such as debate, I love debate, but if you're not a lawyer, I'd find talking straight at someone for 4 minutes, despite being sort of this interview, is not particularly conducive for real life you know, work, whether you're a doctor, an engineer, or any other professional. This is a way in which the EU is funding young people to gain soft skills that you will take throughout, you know, your lifetime, but also an understanding of where Malaysia's position in ASEAN and interacting with the EU as well. How these impacts everyone,
Yeah.
young people. So it's a program that's open for everyone to join. You know, even if you're a beginner, don't worry. We have recruited some incredible academics. You know, maybe you'll even get to meet some ambassadors who will tell you about their experiences. And a platform like this is so incredibly important. And I wish I had a platform like this when, well, I'm at my age, 19 or even younger, so that I would be able to, you know, have access to these diplomatic discussions, learn about what's happening in the room, because as young people, I feel that sometimes it feels like we're being shut out of that conversation. And we're bringing the conversation to us.
Right, we're given the opportunity.
Yes, we're given the opportunity. So this is why it's very important for a program like this.
Right. So if I were 18 to 24 years old and I wanted to apply for this, what do I have to do, basically? So you just simply go up to the MYADP website. You can access this through our social medias. So our Instagram is at @myadp_org. And you can go to our website, apply, submit an essay on your views about the European Union, your views about the world. We'll vet you through and we'll let you know if your application is successful. So it's very simple. It could be views on anything, any topic at all, or just generally?
We have prompters in our application form, but don't worry. I know writing an essay sounds incredibly challenging, you know, where a lot of us are students, you know, who don't want to take too much time off your day, but don't worry, we have prompts on our social media to help guide you through. But really, we just want to hear your voice, which is why the platform exists in the first place.
Right. Okay, so with the little time that we have, I want to touch a little bit on climate change and climate policy. This is something that when we talk about youths, this is something that we're more, you know, more concerned about as compared to, you know, to the previous generations. So there are a lot of climate policy one perspective is climate policy and another is climate business. I want to get Qyira's views actually. What are your views on climate policies and how could we actually implement better policies in Malaysia?
So the caveat, I am not a climate expert, but I think just by working with my peers in activism and working with communities on the ground, grassroots communities, I think climate policy first and foremost must prioritize grassroots engagement. Looking at who are the most affected when it comes to disasters is often children, women, indigenous communities, marginalized folks. They are the hardest hit and the hardest to recover when it comes to disasters. So I think these are the stakeholders that our governments and institutions, when they look into, must take into account the most. Take into account seriously and prioritize their well-being and their safety. And secondly, of course, I think when it comes to looking at resources and funding support, I sincerely believe that funding support, direct support, must be given to organizations or groups that work directly with communities. Because if we don't empower them directly, they are the ones that are going through the everyday, what I'm trying to say is that they are the ones that will appreciate the impact of good policies, or they will bear the brunt of bad policies. So their input and their work must be prioritized and must be referred to and must be funded, right? The work to preserve, the work to conserve, the work to even produce research, and the work and access must be given to them to have their voices heard at important sessions. So with the upcoming budget that's going to be retabled, I'm sure, I hope that the Ministry of Finance would engage these groups, because it's really, really important to hear from them what their recommendations are. Otherwise, you don't need a climate expert to know, to see, to observe the disastrous impact of climate change, right? And you don't need to be an expert to see who are the ones being affected the most. So these are the voices that we must prioritize and must hear, and that's my opinion about it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Carmen, with your experience, working with the UN model? I'm sure there are topics on climate change. What do you have to say?
Oh yes, definitely. One of the topics that's been debated incredibly, especially last December with the incredibly devastating floods that have just wrecked Malaysia, is how ASEAN and how multilateral relations and information sharing can help in mitigating these things. But also, it's very important as young Malaysians, when you're role-playing a diplomat, or even if you're someone who's participating in society, when we look at policy is such a strange and ambiguous big word, but really what it is translating what people promise us, what our leaders promise us, into a piece of paper. And it's really important that young people, and that they have the skills to analyze, read, make these policies. I've heard in a Model UN conference, one of my delegates, they were representing Malaysia in, I believe it was ECOSOC, one of the United Nations environmental programs, and they were pitching to the Council, the fake United Nations, about how some measures taken by orang asli can help with rebuilding forests, and re-inculcating that very deeply rooted knowledge that we uniquely have as Malaysians. And that's something that we can share with the world, and that's something that we hope through multilateralism and regionalism that can be shared from other countries to us as well. So that's where we stand in terms of Malaysian youth in writing, making and suggesting these policies.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, that's a very, very good point, especially. But that's all the time that we have right now. So thank you once again, both of you, for joining us on It's About Youth. My name is Soraya Mia, and we'll see you again on the next episode.